is there any study like to show like emerging leaders, the nodes that coming might be important in the future, that kind of thing?
There's a lot of people trying to do all kinds of things, especially with online social networks. So it's great. There's not students working with me, but there's a couple students that I talk to from time to time who are really interested in trying to look at dynamics on Facebook. So, what's growing, what's shrinking. So the way that they find to access data on Facebook is that they write applications, and they'll write some game, and they'll end up having millions of users using these games in the course of a couple months. So it's just remarkable. They think of things that people need. So one of them is called Fight Club. So if we're friends and we're having a conflict, we'll discuss what our conflict is on Facebook, and all our friends get to weigh in and tell us whose side they're on and why they're right, why they're wrong. And so they're able to scrape a lot of data this way and look at the dynamic patterns that's going on. And so we can see things like an adaptation of these ideas as they percolate through extended networks. So, and actually, so this is a really good point, because everything that I'm talking to you about, we've come up to more from thinking about computer science, statistics, mathematics, but there's been a tremendous amount of work on social networks that way predates this, coming from sociologists. So they've always been very interested in understanding why people would come together and form dyads. There's a lot of beautiful work on political alliance networks that end up looking like spin glasses. So typically we always think the friend of my friend is my friend, and in Facebook and most social networks we see these reinforcing triangles. So triangles of friendship all over the place. If I'm friends with A and B, then A and B meet and they become friends. So we see these reinforcing friendship triangles. But once you go to the real world and you start looking at politics, you see a lot of frustrated triangles. So they look a little bit like the spin glass models that Ken was mentioning. So, so the sociologists have spent a tremendous amount of work thinking about why two edges, why two nodes would form an edge, what are the structural roles of the nodes in the networks, what roles do they play, things like that.
Yes, here.
What sorts of physical situations would there exist that you'd actually have a chance of choosing such nodes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't really know of too many places like that. So perhaps if you're doing some market research, you might probe two different connections. One of the places that probing edges has been really interesting has been in thinking about immunizations. So I know if I choose a node, I'm just going to end up with whoever. But if I choose a node and I follow an edge from that node, I'm really likely to get to a hub, because hubs have proportionally so many more edges. So this is called contact immunization, and it's something that Center for Disease Control has been doing for quite a long time. So they sample an individual and they ask, who's your friend? And they immunize your friend instead of you. But this is a really good point, is how do we connect these mathematical models that we can say rigorous things about to reality? And I don't really know what the question, how to answer that. It could be when we start thinking about infrastructure systems where we do have full information, we start thinking about the World Wide Web. Obviously, we have no idea what the internet looks like. Unless you're working for AT&T or Sprint or a backbone provider, you have no idea what the internet looks like, right? There's lots of tomography that we do and try and extract it, but all those have a lot of artifacts that lead us to believe false things about the structure of the internet. So, but maybe if you're trying to do something with the World Wide Web where you have a complete picture, you can start thinking about where do I want to add additional edges.
And what would a phase transition in, say, the internet look like?
So I think that there, what we're mostly concerned about is things like viruses reaching pandemic states. So the phase transition would be in how many nodes are infected, and we might see this virus take off.
There's a hand in the back before. No? Okay, here. Oh, sorry.
An example might be, and this, I don't know if this is a physical situation, but you were mentioning open source software previously. If you were a developer considering joining an open source project, you might very well choose to make your edge between you and some other developer towards a larger group rather than a smaller group. So you look at several projects that work in the same area and choose the one that seems to be the most popular. That would accord with, I think, as you were saying, accelerating the transition sooner, which might actually be less popular until, who knows.
And that's in itself a really beautiful sociological study, is how do people choose to attach themselves in open source software. So, the open source is amazing that all these people all over the world are giving their time to write this code, and there's a lot of status with becoming a developer who has commit privileges. So there's been a lot of studies about how do you plug yourself in to accelerate your becoming a commit privileged developer.
Yeah. Has there been much work on it's possible in the network to create artificial nodes, virtual nodes that don't really exist? And a lot of what has happened with collateralized debt obligations could be put this way. And I'm wondering, whether there's been any work on the stability of a system like that. I mean, there's $550 trillion worth of this stuff out there, and we have no idea what it is stable. So I thoughts from the ones that have
I can quite catch. You say you talk about collateralized debt obligations of enormous magnitude, but what was the point? How does this do the links? How does that do the networks?
You can look at those structures and the way they've been set up as a network. And in fact, if you look at the individual lenders, they have a finite number of nodes. But if you look at it as certain obligations being wired to other obligations, almost independent of an individual financial institution, the network suddenly looks a lot different.
Well, it depends if it's a network among people or a network. I think one of the points about multiple networks, I'm not sure it's quite the same thing as you're saying. You can take as your unit a person or an obligation. Presumably the number of people is finite. It's just 300 million people if we could confine ourselves to the United States. And now there is an intertemporal aspect. I think that's what you're really getting at, although I may be wrong. Namely that you have obligations, they don't all come due at the same time. So you got a complicated structure. In fact, the difference between the maturity of different credit has been a lot of emphasis about it. A lot of these long-term things were being financed on 24-hour loans. So this is perfectly real. I'm not making up a theoretical point here. That the obligations. So, for example, to point out, if you have all these huge obligations, they can't all be real. I mean, nobody borrows. You have $550 trillion or whatever. It's a higher figure than any I've heard, but whatever it is. Divided by the number of people, you get a huge number. Of course, the answer is people are both creditors and debtors. It's got to cancel out. And if you imagine as a network, one of the things that somebody looking from above and who could see through the network, which is not so easy, could say, oh, I see circles. So why don't we just eliminate the common part of that? You can show, as a theorem, that if you have a bunch of obligations, you can always reduce it without changing anybody's net wealth to one-directional flows. I owe you, and that's it. There's no further. Either I'm a creditor, in which case I lend to I have no debts, or I'm a debtor, I have no credits, and I'm only dealing with one person. All links are one link. But if these obligations have different maturities, you can't cancel them out so simply. I can default, that causes you to default, that causes a third person to default, it winds up affecting me again. Whereas if we sat down, we could have, if we could someone, and that's, of course, one of the problems is the economists in their theoretical side have been accustomed to dealing with markets. If you really have market clearing operations, this can't happen. But these credit default swaps and things like that were private contracts. They weren't on a market at all. So you couldn't get the automatic clearing that you would get from, say, like futures markets and the wheat futures market, let's say. And this huge buildup obviously must have a tremendous amount of circularity in it. Nobody, take the average value, nobody owns that much money and nobody owes that much money.
The problem is that
Net.
there's no guiding hand to look at that and do exactly
But you see, the glory of the economists from 200 years, and that's the glory of the economic system, is that it works without a regulating hand. And indeed, there's a very strong argument that if you really had a regulating hand, the amount of information needed to run the system is so vast that nobody could control it. I mean, it wouldn't even be possible. And also, there'd be a problem about incentives, which I want to go into. But even if, just for the information, that's Friedrich von Hayek made a great point. But in a sense, that's been implicit in most economists' view of the economy. That the reason, what's beautiful about it, that's why I said the invisible hand, is that nobody really knows what's going on. Nobody really knows what's going on in more than a small part of the economy, and nevertheless, it meshes. Now, the trouble is, it doesn't always mesh. And that's what as we see now. But at least it does mesh a good part of the time, and you certainly do not want to depend on having an overall regulatory function, because simply nobody's capable. We simply don't have the capacity for that. Information is distributed.
And it's this.
And not easily transmittable, because some of it, you're not even aware you know it. It's called tacit information.
Hand in the back.
Riz, I was fascinated by a passing comment you made about self-organizing, and kind of maybe this is to both of you. It seems as though one of the criticisms of economic modeling is that it makes unrealistic assumptions. But a number of the phenomena you're talking about almost require no assumptions whatsoever about human behavior. People know each other, and that's about it. So are there any observations? Your stuff is mostly peer-to-peer with a little bit of directed. Are there any sort of findings we have from physics or other analogs that tell us something about hierarchies that are self-organizing? Because I remember reading some passing comment in the last year, something about warlords are sort of a natural phenomenon of a certain type of social system, which presumably doesn't require any sort of institutional assumptions or assumptions about human behavior.
And so there's actually been a fair amount of interesting work on thinking about hierarchies in network structures. And typically we think about companies being structured as hierarchical systems, may not have the best information flows up and down the tree, great up-down communication, not great bottom-up communication. And we've seen a lot of companies be a little bit more innovative. Like I know McKinsey is renowned for having a very flat structure where people can talk to one another. But maybe one of the interesting things to think about is the minimal level of organization that then allows a hierarchy to happen. Right? So if we look at our biology is probably a really great example, because if we look at our own bodies, there's levels of interaction from the atomic to the to an organism to the central nervous system that controls the body as a whole. So there's all these layers of hierarchy that emerge from the simpler levels, right? So as we saw life evolve, we saw it gain more complexity and more diversity of cell types. So there's probably some minimal amount of structure that has to be there at the basic level before we can start building hierarchies on it.
Yes, here.
On a similar note, this feeds into that. Curious about your observation on what you've learned. What does that imply for designers of complex systems, or perhaps complex software applications, which typically can be processing nodes that are making calls to or receiving calls from others? But in particular, where you used to do it back in the old days, believe it or not, was sort of top-down architecture and floor plans. We had kind of a hierarchy of that. And what does this imply for how systems behave? Designers ought to be behaving more the same, very differently. Forget about architecture, do architecture.
Well, so there's one really important thing that I didn't talk about because I didn't want to keep everyone here all night long. But one of the so my talk that I was focused on today was really looking at topology. So who's connected to who, and what does that topology, what are the implications for a network? But there's another aspect which is equally fundamental, and that is actually the flow that's happening on a network. Right? So if you have a hub and no one ever wants to communicate with this hub, and the hub is gone, you wouldn't even notice. So there's a lot of additional, I guess the whole picture gets changed when we start thinking about who's actually using this network and how they're using it. So you probably deal with that a lot, thinking about architecting systems. So if you have one particular function that has to be called by everybody, maybe you need to make copies of it or cache it somewhere so that latency is reduced. So I think that when you're thinking about a real system, you're going to have to find the marriage between the flows and the topologies. And coming from physics,